resignations at Yorkshire Cricket Club over failures to deal with racism in its ranks.
It's a really difficult day for me. I'm very sad. I'll have to resign from a club that I love.
The chairman's gone, along with more board members, as the BBC drops former Yorkshire player and England captain Michael Vaughan after allegations from another South Asian player. Also tonight, the killing of 15-year-old Kion Lincoln. A fifth man's found guilty, with more details emerging of the night the teenager's life was taken.
Make action now. Don't just be talking, just make action now.
Thousands of children bunk off school to join Greta Thunberg to march to save the planet in Glasgow. And it's not quite thank you for the music from ABBA fans as the band releases its comeback album.
This is the ITV Evening News with Charlene White.
Good evening. The chairman of Yorkshire County Cricket Club and two other board members have quit as the racism row engulfing the club deepened tonight. Roger Hutton apologised to former player Azim Rafiq for the way his racial abuse allegations were dealt with. He said there's a culture at Yorkshire which refused to accept change or challenge. And former Yorkshire player and England captain Michael Vaughan is also accused. Two cricketers have accused him of making racist comments. He strongly denies the claims, but has been dropped from next week's edition of his BBC radio show. From Headingley, here's Ben Chapman with the latest.
Yorkshire feels like a cricket club under siege. Yet another major sponsor abandoned it today, along with three members of the board, over its handling of racism allegations. Among those resigning, the chairman, Roger Hutton.
I have enormous sympathy for Azim Rafiq and I've apologised.
He said he apologised to the cricketer Azim Rafiq while releasing a stinging statement about the club. There has been a constant unwillingness from the executive members of the board and senior management at the club to apologise, he said, and to accept that there was racism. I experienced a culture that refuses to accept change or challenge. The club hasn't addressed his allegations directly, but it has already appointed a new chair, Lord Kamlash Patel of Bradford, who says he's looking forward to driving the change that's needed. But most of the board remains in place. And the club is still under pressure to publish its report into Azim Rafiq's allegations, after it reportedly dismissed a racial slur against him as banter. Rafiq went public with his claims last September, prompting the investigation. A year later, the club confirmed there had been racial harassment, but denied institutional racism. And last month said there had been no conduct that warrants disciplinary action. Tonight, the BBC dropped the former England captain Michael Vaughan from the radio next week, following Rafiq's apparent claim that he told a group of Asian players that there were too many of you lot. He denies it, but another player, Rana Navid Al-Hassan, told ITV News he also heard Vaughan say it.
We was playing in 2009 at Nottinghamshire, and I was part of that team. And Mr. Vaughan used that word, there is too many of you.
Michael Vaughan hasn't responded further to the claims. Meanwhile, Yorkshire has already lost sponsors and England matches and faces a protest here tomorrow from supporters who've lost faith. Ben Chapman, ITV News, Headingley.
Well, our sports editor Steve Scott has joined us in the studio. I mean, Steve, this is an appalling situation for Yorkshire. Could it get any worse?
Well, you might not think it possibly could, but I think it actually will. My understanding is there are the number of current or former players named in this investigation runs into double figures. So either they will identify themselves over the coming days, a bit like Michael Vaughan has today, or they'll be named when Azim Rafiq gives evidence to MPs in a couple of weeks' time. But this crisis has now spread far beyond Yorkshire's borders. The ECB are admitting privately that they're having uncomfortable conversation with their commercial partners. But of course, it's the damage goes way beyond the financial. cricket's reputation really is at stake here. How do you persuade the next generation of British Asians to take it up when they see a sport that handles such a serious crisis in the way it has? Lord Patel's appointment, I think, will help. His Asian heritage, of course, will help too. But as things stand, two of Yorkshire's executive directors are not going anywhere. Until they do, it will be hard to convince anyone the club is really repentant and is ready for wholesale change.
OK, Steve, thank you. A fifth teenager was found guilty today of killing 15-year-old Kion Lincoln, who was shot and stabbed outside his Birmingham home. The schoolboy was attacked by a gang last January. The boy who shot him, the boy who used the gun, was aged just 14. Detectives say there's nothing to suggest Leon's murder was linked to a gang dispute and think he may have been attacked by chance. Sejal Karia has more.
Kion Lincoln, full of life, full of energy, with a beaming smile according to his family, was just 15 when he was shot and stabbed metres from his front door in Birmingham. This, one of his killers, Michael Oguchukwu, caught on CCTV armed with the knife he stabbed Kion with just seconds later, one of a group of teenagers who murdered him, the youngest of whom was the gunman at just 14. Kion's mother, Charlene, left grieving her son, a child killed at the hands of children.
We heard what happened, heard the gunshots, and my first instinct was, where's my son? Those are the first words I said, where's my son?
The group drove to Kion's house in this stolen white car, armed with knives and a loaded gun. He'd been standing on the street. This the moment the car stopped and the attack began, when Kion was chased, stabbed before being shot dead. Police later found the car abandoned. Inside the footwell, one of the knives used in the attack that lasted just 40 seconds. Two of the killers were caught on CCTV in the aftermath. They, 18-year-old Tarjim Breckenridge and Michael Oguchukwu, were found guilty of murder, alongside a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old who can't be named because of their age. A fifth teenager, 18-year-old Kieran Donaldson, who supplied the weapons, was found guilty of manslaughter.
It has been extremely difficult knowing that those responsible for such a terrible act were only very young themselves. Why would they pick up such, deadly weapons, including a firearm, and decide to use it against another individual?
Some believe Kion was the victim of a post-Code War, but police say they still don't know exactly why he was targeted. Another young life lost in a senseless killing. Sejal Karia, ITV News.
Several charities have called for a public inquiry into the sex attacks carried out by David Fuller on dozens of bodies in mortuaries. Yesterday, the 67-year-old admitted abusing at least 78 corpses over a decade, as well as to the murder of two women in Kent in 1987. The Centre for Women's Justice said a full inquiry must be set up to find out how he was able to carry out his crimes for so long. Education Secretary Nadeem Zahawi today admitted the government did make a mistake by trying to block the suspension of Conservative MP Owen Paterson, but he defended the Prime Minister's handling of the affair. Our political correspondent Libby Vina is over at Westminster for us. Libby, Downing Street's keen to move on from this, but the claims of sleaze are unlikely to stop, though.
No, well, as you say, the Education Secretary did admit that the government had made a mistake this week, but he seemed to be saying that it was an honest mistake. The government had simply got it wrong when it tried to change the rules for punishing MPs at exactly the same moment that a former minister, Owen Paterson, was facing suspension from the House of Commons for actually lobbying in an improper way. He was found guilty of that by a parliamentary committee. Now, many backbenchers found the idea that it was a coincidence that the government was trying to change the rules at the time that Mr. Paterson was facing disciplinary action. Well, that didn't wash with them, and they were furious at the fact that they were made to vote for this change in the rules, and then the government performed a U-turn within 24 hours. Now, Gavin Barwell, a chief of staff to Mr. Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May, said that he believed that many people would be questioning as to whether the Prime Minister really was getting the right advice. Meanwhile, Labour are calling for the whole system to be reformed. They say it's quite wrong for MPs to be allowed to take paid lobbying jobs.
Libby, thank you. Greta Thunberg addressed a large climate rally in Glasgow today and called the COP26 summit that's being held in the city a failure. The climate campaigner said world leaders are carrying on with business as usual when immediate and drastic emission cuts are needed. It came as thousands of young activists, many who've been inspired by her, demanded politicians to take action. From Glasgow, here's our Scotland correspondent, Peter Smith.
This movement started with a lone 15-year-old girl striking outside her school every Friday. Today, Greta Thunberg was joined by 15,000 following in her footsteps through Glasgow.
When I watched I Am Greta, I just felt so inspired.
We're trying to make up for lost time, really.
Make up for lost time? You don't see this as skipping school to be here today?
No, absolutely not, because we are the future generation and they're all going to have to live with the effects of it.
Just make action now. We want action. We want justice. We want equality.
More action. And we want it now.
More action.
How old are you?
11 years old.
Is this your first protest?
Yes.
These Fridays for Future marches are now a global phenomenon. And in the host city of COP26, children, adults, and even four-legged campaigners marched for miles to hear their de facto leader speak.
Some people say that we are being too radical, believing that our civilization as we know it can survive a 2.7 degree or a 3 degree hotter world, on the other hand, is not only extremely radical, it's pure madness.
She wasn't asked to speak to world leaders at this COP, but Greta Thunberg proved to the politicians she doesn't need an invitation to be heard.
I think Greta's doing a lot. She's only 19, I think, and she's made a lot of differences. A lot of people are listening to her. It was just incredible knowing all the things that she's done for the planet, and just thinking that I've actually got to see her in person is just incredible.
World leaders already left Glasgow COP, but they aren't the audience anymore. Because this green revolution, led predominantly by young women, isn't here to ask for change, they're here to start it. Peter Smith, ITV News, Glasgow.
Still to come in the ITV Evening News. With COVID infections still high, more schools in England bring back masks and...
At last, we've got loads of new songs to learn and we're very excited about that.
We get the fans' reaction to ABBA's new album. Those stories and more after the break. Welcome back. Coronavirus infections remain at or near record levels across the UK. The latest figures show the number of cases are still high, although there are signs it may have peaked. Infections among secondary school children have dipped for the first time in weeks, but some local authorities in England are now recommending pupils wear masks inside school again. Here's our health editor, Emily Morgan.
This is the reality now for these school children. Cleaning their desks before they leave the lesson, and for some even wearing masks during it. But this is pretty unique. Cambridgeshire County Council has asked all its schools to reintroduce face masks in communal areas because of high levels of COVID, something pupils are pleased about.
You feel a bit safer, do you, wearing it?
Yeah, especially in the high traffic areas like the canteen and the corridors.
I don't really mind it because it just means that we can get back to normal sooner.
More than half of all the cases in this area are amongst school-aged children, but vaccination teams haven't even visited Sawston Village College yet, and the principal is frustrated at how little is being done to support them.
I'm not sure the measures alone are going to help us with mitigating transmission. And we're doing everything that we can. It's just that I think there are possibly some more measures, and certainly at a national level, some more support that could help us stopping it ripping through schools.
No school in this country has been immune to COVID. In the first half of this term, this school had nearly 20% of its kids off with the virus at some point. And yes, mask wearing in the corridors will have some sort of effect, but rates among school-aged children are still very high.
And since masks are not compulsory in schools in England, most rely on good ventilation. But despite this public health campaign promoting it, one government advisor admits it should be combined with other measures.
The highest risk of exposure is probably when you're very close to somebody, and ventilation really doesn't tackle that very well.
But there are really no other measures in schools, are there, at the moment, other than ventilation?
That's right, and it is a very challenging environment for schools.
Rates in children do appear to be finally falling, but infections are still near record levels. It begs the question whether masks in schools could help bring those down even further. Emily Morgan, ITV News in Cambridgeshire.
An experimental pill to treat COVID-19 has been shown to cut the risk of hospitalisation or death by 89%. The results of the new antiviral pill made by Pfizer surpasses the effectiveness of another treatment given the go-ahead by regulators in the UK yesterday. And at least 853 migrants crossed the English Channel from France to the UK on Wednesday, a new record this year. The Home Office say there were a total of 25 incidents. The Food Standards Agency has told ITV News new rules are urgently needed over labelling products' carbon footprint. Most manufacturers don't know or don't show what that figure is. And there are concerns over the accuracy of those who do display it, as our consumer editor Chris Choi now explains.
With environmental impact, you are what you eat. Up to a third of our carbon footprint comes from diet. That's led to a rush of new labels, logos and claims. But senior officials have told us new rules are urgently needed.
Do you know the climate impacts of the products that you buy?
This temporary shop is showcasing new carbon footprint labels to gauge customers' reactions.
I think having a starting point of brands coming forward and putting this on their packaging, it will lead somewhere eventually.
New research shows 70% of shoppers want more environmental information. We've learned that around 25,000 UK products have already had their carbon footprints independently measured. 2040 is the target set by the UK's food industry to achieve net carbon zero. It's being called the UK's first carbon-neutral egg, using local feed, solar power and specially selected hens. But in environmental labelling, there's often complexity. Here, there is still a carbon footprint, but it's offset by paying for rainforest conservation credits, a widespread practice.
Wouldn't it be fairer if you said almost carbon neutral?
We do state that it's low CO2, so it's a nod to the fact that we've reduced the carbon footprint already. Carbon neutral actually means something. But
it's not true, and it's not entirely carbon neutral.
Well, it is, because we've bought the credits and we have done all we can at this very moment to reduce the carbon footprint as much as possible.
What matters is a label that matters.
The UK's food labelling laws are yet to catch up with all this, so a potentially baffling array of logos and ways of expressing carbon impact are being used.
Why is it taking so long to get consistent regulation of this kind of labelling?
There's an enormous sense of urgency here. Well, any regulatory change that is enshrined in law is going to take a long time. So what I hope is that before that point, we'll get to a position of agreement between the major retailers and indeed food producers.
The fight for environmental information on food as a new consumer right is now underway, and it's likely to gather pace as more firms seek carbon kudos. Chris Choi, ITV News.
And finally tonight, the last time ABBA released a studio album, Raiders of the Lost Ark was in the cinemas. Muhammad Ali was about to have his last fight, and Prince Charles and Lady Diana had just married. But a lot has happened since 1981. So 4 decades on, is ABBA's comeback album Voyage worth the wait? Well, here's our arts editor, Nina Nana.
40 years ago, they said they were taking a short break. Now in their 70s, they've popped back to record one of the most anticipated releases of recent times. What started out as a get-together in the studio to record 2 songs became Voyage, an album of 10 new ABBA tracks.
The opportunity to write new music for ABBA and to record it, and then coming out of the studio and sort of, yeah, I like the result. And I speak to Frida and Agneta, and I know they're extremely happy.
They're not the only ones. ABBA tribute bands like Fabba Girls at last have some new material to play with.
But I remind myself of who we are.
And they're already practising the new songs for their repertoire.
At last, we've got loads of new songs to learn and we're very excited about that.
ABBA have not disappointed you?
No, not at all. I love the way they've kept everything in the proper ABBA vein, the way I think it should be. I hope everyone loves the album.
Student Sharnika is doing her thesis on ABBA fans like her. She now needs to write another chapter. This is going to be the last album.
It's really nice closure for the fans today to get that final album and to know it's the final album and to just be able to hear ABBA in all their glory.
Even if Adele beats them to the Christmas #1, the band still have their digital avatar show next year. ABBA's voyage continues. Nina Nana, ITV News in southwest London.
You've got to love a bit of ABBA. All right, that's it for now. Raggy will be here at the latest time for 10:20. Until then, bye-bye.